My name's Alex. I'm 27, and if you had told me a year ago that one day I'd be lying on my kitchen floor gasping for air while my own mother accused me of faking it, I probably would have laughed and said you'd been watching too many bad soap operas. But here we are. It all started in the middle of an ordinary Saturday afternoon. I was home for the weekend, visiting my mom's house for what was supposed to be a family day. My mom, Sandra, has never been what you'd call warm and nurturing. Growing up, she had two settings, cold and critical. If I got an A in school, she'd ask why it wasn't an A+. If I landed a job, she'd ask why it wasn't a better one. And if I ever got sick or hurt, she'd tell me to toughen up. To her, illness was weakness, and weakness was something to be mocked. My aunt, Denise, is my mom's younger sister and a permanent fixture at the house whenever there's a gathering. She's the kind of person who thrives on gossip and finds joy in pointing out other people's flaws, especially mine. She's the fun aunt to my cousins, but when it comes to me, she's got a sarcastic comment for every breath I take. The dynamic between the two of them has always been like some twisted comedy duo, my mom as the lead critic, my aunt as the snarky sidekick. That day, the house was buzzing with noise. My cousins were in the living room playing video games. My mom was in the kitchen barking orders about setting the table, and my aunt was sipping wine, acting like the queen of the place. I'd been feeling a bit off since morning, lightheaded, a strange pressure in my chest, but I didn't want to be dramatic. Growing up in that environment trains you to swallow complaints before they ever leave your mouth. While I was helping carry a box of drinks from the garage, the sensation in my chest tightened. It was like someone had hooked a bungee cord around my ribs and started pulling. I put the box down slowly, trying not to make a scene. My vision blurred for a second, and when I reached for the counter to steady myself, my hand missed, and I ended up on my knees. The sound of a glass clinking against the counter made me realize my mom had walked in. "Oh, for crying out loud," she said, as if I had just spilled juice on the carpet. "Cut the act, Alex. I'm not falling for whatever this is." I tried to respond, to tell her I couldn't breathe right, but the words wouldn't come out. My chest felt heavy, my throat was dry, and panic started to bubble up. That's when my aunt stepped in from the dining room, eyes already rolling. "Pathetic," she said with a little laugh. "Anything to skip chores, huh? What's next? Faking a broken leg because you don't want to carry plates?" They stood there, staring at me like I was putting on some ridiculous show. My mom actually crossed her arms and shook her head, and my aunt smirked like she was enjoying the performance. I could hear my cousins in the other room laughing at something on the TV, completely unaware that I was barely holding on. I wanted to scream that this wasn't an act, that something was seriously wrong, but my breath came in shallow gasps. I remember clutching the floor with one hand and trying to wave at them with the other, hoping they'd realize this wasn't fake. But their faces didn't change, just that mix of irritation and amusement. The next thing I knew, my mom was telling me to get up and stop embarrassing myself, because we had guests coming over soon. She even muttered something about how dramatic I'd been since I was a kid. My aunt laughed again and said, "If you're going to fake it, at least commit to the bit." I don't know how much time passed before my vision tunneled completely, but when I opened my eyes again, I was in the back seat of my mom's car. Apparently, she decided to take me to urgent care after my aunt convinced her that maybe it's an anxiety thing and they'll give him something to calm down. They hadn't even called an ambulance, just loaded me into the car like I was a stubborn teenager refusing to go to school. At the clinic, I was barely able to stand when we walked in. The nurse at the front desk took one look at me and called for someone in the back. Within a minute, I was in a wheelchair being rushed into an exam room. That's when the doctor came in, glanced at me, and started asking rapid-fire questions. How long I'd been feeling this way, whether I had any pre-existing conditions. I tried to answer, but every word felt like it cost me air I couldn't spare. Then they ran the scan, and I'll never forget the look on the doctor's face when the results popped up on the monitor. His whole expression dropped, and he turned to the nurse with this urgent tone I'd only ever heard in movies. "Prep for emergency surgery, now." My mom froze. My aunt stopped smirking, and I, despite the fog in my head, felt this strange mix of fear and vindication. For the first time in years, they weren't laughing. And that was just the beginning of what would become the breaking point in my relationship with my family. The next few hours were a blur of bright lights, masked faces, and the metallic smell of antiseptic. I remember the sting of and for being put in and the rush of a gurney down a hallway, my head bouncing slightly with each turn. At some point, the doctor explained that there was an internal blockage causing severe complications, life-threatening if not addressed immediately. I caught the words close call and dangerous rupture, but the rest faded into a haze as the anesthesia pulled me under. When I woke up, it was in the hospital recovery ward. My throat was dry, my body heavy, but the pain was dulled, replaced with an unfamiliar stillness. I turned my head and saw my mom sitting in the corner, scrolling through her phone. My aunt was beside her, whispering something that made them both smirk. "Oh, look who's finally awake," my mom said, her voice flat. "You gave us quite a scare." The whole day got thrown off schedule. Thrown off schedule. Like my almost dying was an inconvenient hiccup in her weekend plans. "Yeah," my aunt added, leaning forward. "Your little stunt meant we had to cancel the dinner plans." Everyone was disappointed. I stared at them, trying to process if they were being serious. "Stunt," I croaked, my voice rough. My aunt shrugged. "Well, you know what I mean. You've always had a flair for the dramatic." The room was quiet for a moment except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. My mom sighed and stood up. "Anyway, the doctor said you'll be fine now. But you really need to work on not letting things get this bad. If you had told us you were feeling unwell earlier, maybe it wouldn't have come to this." It was as if the whole part where they ignored me while I was gasping for air didn't happen. They'd rewritten the story in their heads already, casting me as the one who'd caused the trouble by not speaking up enough. Over the next 2 days, while I was still hooked up to IVs and under observation, their visits were inconsistent. My mom came by twice a day, mostly to drop off some clothes or ask the nurses how soon I'd be discharged. My aunt came less often, but when she did, she brought her favorite pastime, snide commentary. One afternoon, I overheard her talking to my mom in the hallway. "You know, Sandra, maybe if Alex had taken better care of himself, we wouldn't be here. He's always been a bit fragile. Not like your other two." My other two. She meant my younger siblings, Jake and Emily. The golden children. Jake, the charismatic extrovert who never seemed to do wrong, and Emily, the perfect student with the spotless social media feed. My mom doted on them in ways I'd never experienced. If Jake so much as sneezed, she'd rush to his side with soup. If Emily had a stressful week at school, my mom would rearrange her whole schedule to help her decompress. But when it came to me, any problem I had was either self-inflicted or exaggerated. I lay there, listening, the sting of their words sharper than anything the foreign needle had done to me. When Jake and Emily finally visited, it was almost worse. Emily gave me a polite hug, the kind you'd give a distant acquaintance, and asked, "So, how bad was it, really?" Jake didn't even sit down, just stood at the foot of the bed with his hands in his pockets. "Mom says you're fine now." "That's good." She was really stressed. Stressed. That word sat in my chest like a stone. My mother had been stressed because I almost died, but not in the way you'd think. She was stressed because she'd had to rearrange her weekend, cancel her plans, and deal with doctors instead of dinner guests. On the third night, while I was dozing off, I woke to hear my mom on the phone. She was laughing softly. No, he's okay now. Honestly, I think he just doesn't take care of himself. You know how he is, always in his own little world." The doctors made it sound dramatic, but I think it was blown out of proportion. I closed my eyes, my heart rate picking up. They'd downplayed everything. Even after the surgeon had told them how close I'd been to a fatal rupture, they'd twisted it into a narrative where I was careless and they were the ones inconvenienced. When I was discharged, there was no warmth, no sense of relief in their goodbyes, just to get some rest from my mom and a "don't milk it too much" from my aunt. We drove back to my mom's house in silence, the hum of the car engine the only sound. The next week was supposed to be about recovery, but at home, it became a constant drip of passive-aggressive remarks and little reminders that I'd scared everyone. My mom assigned me small chores to keep me moving despite the doctor's instructions to rest. My aunt dropped by unannounced, bringing up my hospital stay in that mocking tone, as though it were some over-the-top story I'd made up. The worst was the family dinner the following Friday. I'd barely been home a few days, still tired and sore, when my mom insisted I join. I sat quietly at the table, pushing food around my plate while everyone chatted. At one point, my aunt smirked and said, "Careful, Alex, don't choke. Your mom might not believe you this time." The table erupted in laughter. Jake slapped the table. Emily hid her giggle behind her hand. My mom just smiled like it was a harmless joke. I excused myself, my chest tight. Not from the surgery, but from the sheer weight of knowing they saw my near-death experience as nothing more than a punchline. That was the moment something shifted in me. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I decided right then that this dynamic was going to change. I was done playing the quiet, overlooked one who swallowed the hurt. I was done letting them define my story. They had no idea that my recovery time wasn't just going to be about healing. It was going to be about planning. And the first step was to keep my head down and let them think I was back to normal. Because if they thought I was the same Alex they'd always dismissed, they were in for a surprise. Recovery at my mom's house was never really recovery. It was walking on eggshells while being poked with a stick. I kept my head down, doing the light chores she assigned, even though the doctor had warned me to take it easy. I nodded along when my aunt stopped by to check in, but really just wanted to mine more jokes out of my hospital stay. On the surface, I let them think their version of the story had stuck, that I'd been careless, overdramatic, and that they'd been the ones dealing with the fallout. Inside, though, I was watching, listening, filing things away. About 2 weeks after I was discharged, I started to feel strong enough to walk into town. The air was crisp, and for the first time since the surgery, I felt like I could breathe without that ghost of heaviness in my chest. I almost convinced myself that maybe things would just settle, that maybe this could be a turning point where my family would, at the very least, stop making me the butt of every joke. That illusion lasted exactly 3 days. It started on a Thursday night. I came back from a short walk to find my mom and Jake at the kitchen table, both staring at something on my laptop. My laptop, which I'd left in my room, password protected. The lid was open, my files scattered across the screen. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. My mom didn't even flinch. "We needed to check something." "On my laptop?" Jake smirked without looking up. "You should really use stronger passwords." I stepped forward, heart pounding. "That's my personal stuff. You can't just—" "We're family," my mom interrupted, as if that was an all-access pass to my private life. "Besides, you've been so secretive lately. I thought maybe you were hiding something we should know about." The pit in my stomach deepened. "What exactly are you looking for?" She clicked on a folder, my financial documents. "Pay stubs, invoices, bank records. You've been doing better than you let on," she said, her voice cool and almost accusing. I froze. "Look at this," she continued, tilting the screen toward Jake. "No wonder he can afford to take time off work after surgery. He's been sitting on savings." Jake let out a low whistle. "Wow. And here I thought you were barely scraping by." My mom's tone shifted into that familiar mix of condescension and control. "You should have told me. I could have helped you manage it. You're not exactly known for making smart financial decisions." I stepped forward, closing the laptop gently but firmly. "That's none of your business." But it was too late. The damage was done. I could see the wheels turning in her head. My financial privacy had been blown wide open, and the fact that she'd seen those numbers meant she'd start calculating ways to involve herself. The next day proved me right. Over breakfast, she casually mentioned that Emily was looking at graduate programs and might need some help covering tuition. "You've got that money just sitting there," she said. "It would be nice if you contributed to something meaningful for the family." I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. "You're suggesting I pay for Emily's school?" "It's not a suggestion," she said, sipping her coffee. "It's what family does for each other." Jake jumped in. "Yeah, man. You don't have a mortgage or kids. You can afford it." I stared at them, stunned. "You do realize I just had major surgery, right? I might have follow-up expenses, recovery time." "That's all behind you now," my mom cut in, her tone final. It was surreal. Not only had they invaded my privacy, but now they were positioning my savings as some kind of family resource they had the right to redistribute. Over the next few days, it escalated. Emily called me, all sweetness and light, thanking me in advance for considering helping with her tuition. When I told her I hadn't agreed to anything, she acted hurt, like I'd broken some unspoken promise. "I just thought you'd want to invest in my future," she said, her voice dripping with practiced innocence. By Sunday, the ask had transformed into an expectation. My mom had already told Emily to go ahead and start application fees because Alex is going to help. Jake was dropping hints about how nice it was that I was finally stepping up for the family. My aunt, of course, joined in from the sidelines, remarking how mature I'd become now that I was giving back. Giving back, as if I'd been taking from them my whole life instead of the other way around. But the real betrayal came that Monday morning. I logged into my bank account to check a scheduled bill payment, only to see a large transfer had already been made, several $1,000s, to Emily. The note on the transaction read, "Tuition start." I stared at the screen, my pulse thudding in my ears. I hadn't made the transfer. I hadn't even given Emily my account details. That meant someone in the house had done it, while I'd been recovering under their roof. And I knew exactly who. When I confronted my mom, she didn't even try to deny it. "I used the information from those documents on your laptop," she said, as if explaining where she'd found a spare key. "You weren't going to say yes, and this is important. You'll thank me later." Something in me snapped. It wasn't just the money. It was the casual way she admitted it, the complete disregard for my boundaries, the entitlement so deep it didn't even register as wrong in her mind. That was the moment I stopped thinking about whether I should push back and started thinking about how. Because now, it wasn't just about getting my money back. It was about making sure they understood, for the first time in their lives, that I wasn't theirs to control. And I was going to make sure they never forgot it. The morning after I discovered the transfer, I sat in my room staring at the ceiling, feeling like the walls had closed in on me. The air in my mother's house suddenly felt heavier, almost suffocating. Every creak in the hallway reminded me that someone here, my own family, had gone through my private documents, stolen from me, and justified it as if they were doing me a favor. The money wasn't just spare change sitting in my account. It was years of careful saving. Late nights freelancing after my day job, cutting back on little luxuries, turning down trips with friends so I could stay on track. That account wasn't a vault for the family to dip into. It was my safety net, my proof that I could survive on my own without having to crawl back to them. And now, a huge chunk of it was gone, funneled into Emily's future without my consent. That day, I stayed in my room with the door closed. I skipped lunch. I heard my mom knocking once, then her voice. "You can mope if you want, but the decision's made." No apology. Not even an acknowledgement that she'd crossed a line. When I finally dragged myself out of bed in the evening, my body still ached from the surgery. I made my way to the kitchen to get a glass of water and found my aunt at the table with a glass of wine. She looked me over, smirked, and said, "You should feel proud. Not everyone gets to send someone to grad school." I didn't respond. I didn't have the energy. I just went back to my room, shut the door, and sat in the dark. That night was the first time I truly understood what it meant to feel powerless. My mom had access to my personal life, my finances, my living space. I was still recovering physically, which meant I couldn't just pack a bag and leave without risking my health. I had nowhere else lined up to go. My lease had ended before the surgery, and I'd moved in temporarily, thinking it would be a safe place to heal. Now, I realized I'd walked into the lion's den without a way out. The days that followed blurred together. The passive-aggressive comments didn't stop. My mom talked about Emily's bright future over dinner like it was a family victory. Jake made jokes about how I was the quiet investor. My aunt kept dropping in with lines like, "Don't worry, you'll bounce back, unless you're planning to make another scene like in the kitchen that day." Each remark chipped away at me, but I started noticing something. The more I stayed quiet, the more they thought I was resigned to my role in all this. They mistook my silence for surrender. That's when a thought began to take root. I couldn't confront them head-on, not yet. I wasn't strong enough physically, and they'd just turn it into another overreaction to mock. But if I could bide my time, keep my head down while quietly preparing, I could make sure that when I did move, it wouldn't just be to get out. It would be to make sure they could never pull something like this again. I started small. I changed my online banking password from my phone. I opened a separate account at a different bank, transferring what remained of my savings into it. I began keeping important documents zipped inside my duffel bag instead of in the desk drawer. I even started storing small amounts of cash in a sealed envelope in the lining of my jacket, just in case I needed to leave in a hurry. At the same time, I began making mental notes of things I'd overhear. My mom bragging to a neighbor about managing the household finances. My aunt joking about knowing where all the bodies are buried. Jake mentioning that Emily's program still needed another semester's worth of funding. These weren't just idle words. They were threads I could pull when the time came. But even as I was setting the stage, the weight of what had happened didn't lift. There were moments late at night, when the house was quiet, that I'd lie awake and wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe I'd been foolish for keeping my savings a secret. Maybe it was my fault for leaving my laptop out. That's the thing about years of manipulation. You start to question whether you deserve the mistreatment. It was during one of those nights, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight outside my window, that I realized something. They counted on me doubting myself. They thrived on it. Every sarcastic jab, every rewriting of events, every time they turned my pain into a joke, it was all designed to keep me in place. And that was exactly why I had to get out. The problem was, leaving quietly wasn't enough. If I slipped away, they'd just rewrite this too. Tell everyone I'd been ungrateful, selfish, unreliable. I knew my mother well enough to know she'd paint herself as the victim, the selfless parent who took in her difficult child only to be abandoned. No, when I left, it had to be on my terms. And it had to make an impact, which meant I had to endure a little longer. Play the part. Let them think they still had the upper hand. Because when the moment came, I wasn't just walking away, I was taking something with me. And I already knew exactly where to start. In the weeks that followed, I slipped into a routine that, on the surface, looked like compliance. I did the chores my mom asked, showed up for the forced family dinners, even managed the occasional polite laugh when my aunt made her little hospital performance jokes. It was easier to let them believe I'd accepted my place in their hierarchy, quiet, passive, willing to be molded, than to give them any hint of what I was really doing. What they didn't see were the hours I spent late at night, propped up in bed with my laptop, quietly laying the groundwork for my escape and my comeback. I started taking on remote freelance projects again, small ones at first, to ease back into the workload while my body still healed. Then bigger ones. By the third week, I had a steady flow of income, more than enough to start replenishing what had been stolen. This time, every payment went straight into my new bank account, the one no one in that house knew existed. I also started reaching out to old contacts, former clients, colleagues, even a few friends I hadn't talked to in years. At first, it was just casual conversation, catching up. But slowly, I steered the talks toward opportunities. One friend in particular, Mark, mentioned that the small media company he worked for was looking for someone with my skill set. It was remote, well-paid, and offered flexible hours. Within a week, I'd interviewed and been offered the position. I didn't tell my family about the job. As far as they knew, I was still recovering and taking it easy, with no real income. It was a strategic choice. The less they knew, the more they underestimated me. And I needed them to underestimate me if my eventual exit and payback was going to land the way I intended. Meanwhile, I started making quiet investments in myself. I bought a new phone and kept it locked with biometric security, something they couldn't bypass even if they tried. I purchased a fireproof lockbox and stored it in my duffel bag, keeping my passport, important papers, and a few high-value electronics inside. I began tracking every penny I spent and saved, watching the numbers climb steadily upward again. The best part was that my health was improving faster than I'd expected. The doctor cleared me for light exercise, and I took full advantage. I started walking every morning before the rest of the house woke up. By week 4, I was jogging short distances. My energy returned, my mind sharpened, and the fog I'd been living in since before the surgery began to lift. It was like I was reclaiming pieces of myself one by one, pieces they didn't even know I had left. They still tried to control the narrative. My mom bragged to neighbors about how she was taking care of me while I got back on my feet. My aunt would wink and say things like, "Don't worry, we'll keep you from blowing through your savings again," as though they'd done me some great financial service. Jake and Emily seemed to think I was just quietly licking my wounds, waiting for my next family contribution. And honestly, I let them think all of it. I smiled when my mom talked about me being so much calmer now. I shrugged off Jake's comments about how nice it is you're staying home more. I even pretended to take my aunt's advice on budgeting, because the more they thought I was tame, the less they'd suspect I was building an entirely new life right under their noses. A month and a half after the surgery, I signed the lease on a small but modern apartment in a part of town they never visited. It wasn't much, but it was mine, paid for with my own money, furnished with a mix of things I'd kept in storage and a few carefully chosen new pieces. I didn't move in right away. Instead, I kept paying rent on it while still staying at my mom's house. making trips there under the guise of meeting friends. In reality, I was stocking the kitchen, setting up my workspace, and making it fully livable before the day I officially disappeared from their home. During this time, I also started gathering information, not in a malicious, digging through their trash way, but in the way you do when you're preparing for a chess match. I noticed my mom kept all her important documents in an unlocked filing cabinet in her bedroom. I learned from overhearing Jake that he'd been bragging about a side hustle that didn't sound entirely legal. My aunt, after a couple of glasses of wine one night, let slip that she'd been claiming certain family expenses on her taxes, expenses that were, in reality, personal luxuries. I didn't act on any of it right away, but I kept it all stored neatly in my mind, knowing there might come a time when those details would be useful. With each passing week, I felt less like the cornered, powerless version of myself they'd grown comfortable with, and more like the person I'd been before years of family manipulation wore me down, except stronger. Smarter. I wasn't just regaining control, I was quietly gaining leverage. They had no idea that the helpless patient eating dinner at their table was now running a steady income stream, had his own apartment ready, and was sitting on a growing list of the kind of family secrets that could shift the power dynamic forever. And then, just as everything was lining up, they gave me the perfect opportunity to put my plan into motion. It came in the form of a family announcement, one they thought would pull me deeper into their web. But all it did was open the door for my revenge to begin. It was a Sunday afternoon when the family announcement happened. I was sitting at the dining table with my laptop open, pretending to browse for freelance work while actually reviewing my bank transfers for the month. My mom walked in with that particular kind of smile she gets when she's about to tell you something that's less an update and more a declaration of how your life is going to be involved, whether you like it or not. "Family meeting," she said, clapping her hands lightly. Jake and Emily wandered in from the living room, my aunt trailing behind them with her ever-present wine glass. I closed my laptop and sat back, masking my suspicion with a neutral face. Emily was the one who started. So, I got accepted into my top graduate program. She beamed like a bride revealing her engagement ring. "It's in the city, 2 years, amazing faculty. This is huge for me." I smiled politely. "Congratulations." She nodded graciously, then glanced at my mom, who took over. "Here's the thing. Emily's tuition is higher than we thought. Plus, she'll need to live close to campus. The program is intense, so she can't work much while she's in it. That means we're going to need to pitch in as a family to make it happen." I already knew where this was going. I kept my expression blank. "And by we, you mean me?" My mom tilted her head, as if she couldn't believe I'd be so blunt. "Well, you're in a good position right now. You're not tied down with kids or a mortgage. It's just logical." Jake leaned in with a smirk. "Think of it as an investment. Emily gets her degree, makes more money later, and maybe she helps you out in return." My aunt chimed in. "Besides, you've been doing so well lately, haven't you? You seem comfortable." They didn't know how right they were, but for all the wrong reasons. I had the means now, yes, but not to fund Emily's dream. That money was earmarked for something far more important: freedom and payback. "Let's not decide anything today," I said evenly. "I'll think about it." What I didn't say was that I'd already decided, and it wasn't going to be what they wanted. The conversation, however, gave me a piece of information that shifted everything. Emily's program required her to move into the city in just a few months, which meant there would be leases, deposits, contracts, things that required credit checks, bank transfers, and financial records. If my mother had been willing to steal from me once to get her way, there was no reason she wouldn't try to meddle again, especially if she thought she could smooth the process for Emily by using my information or resources without permission. I needed to make sure that, by the time those months rolled around, any attempt to touch my finances would backfire spectacularly. So I started laying the groundwork. First, I scheduled a quiet meeting with my bank manager. I explained, in calm, measured tones, that I had reason to believe a family member might try to access my accounts without my consent. The manager was sympathetic and suggested adding multiple layers of security, new PINs, verbal passcodes, and a flag on the account requiring in-person verification for any large transfers. I also opened a high-security savings account that couldn't be accessed online at all, only in person, with ID and biometric confirmation. Second, I began gathering every shred of documentation I could find about my finances, my work contracts, and my new apartment lease. These went into the fireproof lockbox, along with my passport and personal electronics. The lockbox itself went into my apartment, not in my room at my mom's house, so there was nothing physical they could rifle through even if they tried. Third, I quietly spoke to a lawyer. Not about suing them, yet, but about understanding my options if they ever tried something like the unauthorized transfer again. The lawyer gave me advice on documenting interactions, securing proof, and setting up alerts on my credit to catch any attempts at fraud. But the most important move came from a different angle entirely. A week after the family meeting, I got a call from Mark at the media company I'd started working with. He was impressed with my work and wanted to offer me a bigger role, managing a small team of freelancers. It would mean more money, but also more flexibility. And here's the kicker. It would occasionally require me to host client meetings or small events in the city. That was my in. By accepting the role, I now had a legitimate reason to be in the city regularly, and to be in spaces my family never saw. It meant I could slowly move more of my belongings to the apartment without suspicion. It also gave me access to a broader network of people outside of my family's reach, who could be allies if I needed them. With each passing week, my position grew stronger. My income was steady, my resources secure, my exit strategy nearly complete. And best of all, my family still thought I was floating along, dependent on their goodwill. The day they realized how wrong they were was getting closer. And when it came, it wouldn't just be a quiet exit. It would be a clean break, so sharp, they'd never be able to stitch the narrative back together in their favor. And without realizing it, they just handed me the final tool I needed to make that happen. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and they'd find a way to twist it. Too late, and I risked them getting their hands on something else of mine. I decided that the moment to strike would be right before Emily's big move to the city for grad school. That was when they'd be most distracted, most financially stretched, and least able to react without showing their true colors to outsiders. The weeks leading up to it, I played my part flawlessly. I offered to help Emily research apartments. I sat through family dinners where my mom dropped hints about how generous Alex is going to be. I even went with Emily to tour a couple of places, letting her think I might co-sign something for her. All the while, I was quietly setting up the pieces for what would look to them like a spontaneous collapse, but would actually be the final move in a long game. Step 1 was removing any direct access they had to my personal or financial information. I'd already locked down my bank accounts and moved my documents, but I went a step further. I changed my phone number and set up a P.O. box in the city. Every important contact, bank, employer, lawyer, got my new number and address. My mom and the rest of them still had the old number, which I was now using only as a decoy. Step 2 was controlling the narrative. I quietly reached out to a few extended family members, people my mom loved to brag to, but who didn't know the full picture. I told them, in a careful, measured way, about my upcoming move for work and how I was sad to be leaving my mom's place so soon after she took care of me. The phrasing was deliberate. It made me sound grateful while planting the idea that I'd been independent in the decision. Step 3 was setting the trap. A week before Emily's move, my mom brought up the financial contribution again over dinner, saying, "We'll need to transfer the first few months of rent next Monday." She said it casually, as if it were a foregone conclusion. That was exactly what I'd been waiting for. On Sunday evening, I went to my apartment in the city, bringing the last of my belongings from storage. I set up my workspace, stocked the fridge, and left a spare key with a trusted friend nearby. By the time I returned to my mom's that night, the only things left in my old room were a couple of boxes filled with cheap, replaceable items. Monday morning, right on schedule, my mom knocked on my door with her laptop. "All right, let's get that transfer done." I sat up in bed, stretching lazily. "About that, I can't." Her eyebrows knitted together. "What do you mean you can't? You agreed to this." "I never agreed," I said calmly. "And even if I wanted to, you wouldn't be able to touch my accounts anymore. They're secured." Her face darkened, but before she could speak, I added, "Also, I'm moving out today." The silence in the room was so sharp, it was almost comical. "What?" she snapped. I stood up, pulled my phone from my pocket, and showed her the lease agreement on the screen. "I've had a place in the city for 2 months. Fully furnished. Paid for in advance. I start a new position this week, and I won't need anything from you. My aunt who had been lingering in the hallway with her morning coffee, let out a sharp laugh. "So you've been hiding this? All this time?" "Yep," I said, slipping on my jacket. "And before you start telling people I abandoned you, I've already spoken to Aunt Linda, Uncle Rob, and a few others about how grateful I am for the time here. They'll know exactly how I tell it." My mom's lips pressed into a thin line. "After everything we've done for you." I cut her off with a small, satisfied smile. "After everything you've taken from me, you mean?" I let that hang in the air just long enough before adding, "By the way, the bank is aware of the unauthorized transfer you made last time. If anything like that happens again, they're prepared to take legal action." Her eyes widened, and for once, she had no quick retort. I grabbed my duffel bag, the one with nothing but cheap filler items, and walked past them both. At the front door, I paused. "Oh, and Emily, I hope you've got your rent sorted. You'll need it sooner than you think." The beauty of it was that I didn't have to touch or move directly. Because of my quiet work behind the scenes, the moment my mom tried to use my info for her lease, the system would block her and flag her attempt. Emily would be left scrambling, and there'd be no way to pin it on me without revealing exactly what my mom had done. By the time they figured it all out, I'd be long gone, living in my own place, working my new job, surrounded by people who actually respected me. And they'd be left with nothing but each other, and the knowledge that they'd underestimated me for the last time. 2 weeks after I walked out of my mother's house, I got the first call. It was Emily. I let it go to voicemail, partly because I was in a meeting, but mostly because I already had a good idea what it was about. When I checked the message later, her voice was tight, almost panicked. "Alex, they're saying I can't sign the lease because the co-signer's credit check failed. Mom said she used your info. What did you do?" I didn't respond. The next day, my aunt tried. This time it was less panic and more fury. "So this is your big revenge, huh? Making your sister homeless." I deleted the voicemail without even listening to the rest. The third call came from my mom herself, and I picked up, not to explain, but because I wanted to hear it in her voice. She didn't waste time. "You've made things very difficult for Emily. She's had to settle for a tiny place miles from campus, and now she's behind on applications because of the delay." I kept my tone even. "You made things difficult for yourself. You touched my accounts without permission. Twice. Actions have consequences." She tried to recover, her voice softening in that manipulative way she'd always used when she wanted to reel me back in. "We're family, Alex. We should be helping each other." I almost laughed. "Funny. That's exactly what I did. Helped you understand boundaries." There was a long pause on her end before she said, "People will think you're cruel." I smiled to myself. "Only if you tell them the whole story, and we both know you won't." I hung up before she could answer. Word traveled quickly through the extended family, but thanks to the conversations I'd had before leaving, most people already saw me as the independent one striking out on my own. The version my mom and aunt tried to spread, painting me as ungrateful, didn't gain much traction. In fact, a few relatives reached out to tell me they admired how I'd gotten out on my own terms. Meanwhile, I settled into my apartment fully. My work with the media company thrived. Within months, I had doubled my client list and started mentoring newer freelancers. My health was the best it had been in years, my savings growing steadily in an account no one could touch. I still saw my family occasionally, at larger gatherings where avoiding them completely would have raised eyebrows, but the dynamic had shifted. They no longer made jokes about the hospital or treated me like the perpetual underdog. They kept their distance, their smiles just a bit too tight, their conversations with me short and surface level. And that was exactly how I wanted it. The final nail came at a cousin's wedding 6 months later. I arrived in a tailored suit, confident, with a few colleagues turned friends in tow. My mom approached, clearly about to launch into small talk, when Emily walked up behind her. I caught a glimpse of the bitterness in Emily's eyes before she looked away. "How's school?" I asked lightly. "It's fine," she muttered. "Just a lot of commuting." I gave her a warm, polite smile. "Well, I'm glad you figured it out." Then I excused myself and went back to my table, leaving them standing there. As I sat down, I felt the tension loosen in my chest. I had my life, my independence, my dignity. They had their gossip, their grudges, and their empty seats at the tables they thought they could control. For years, they'd laughed when I was on the floor, gasping for air. Now, I was the one standing tall, while they were left choking on their own pride.